Hello guys, welcome to my channel where stories filled with revenge, moral lessons and love are told. Sit back, listen closely, and if this story touches you, don't forget to like, share with your friends, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Like this one, my name is Valerie Hensley, and for 30 long years, I poured every ounce of myself into one company data raft. I wasn't some high-flying executive in a polished suit giving speeches on CNBC. No, I was the quiet backbone, the one who kept compliance airtight, who spotted loopholes before regulators ever noticed them, who saved this company from lawsuits that could have bankrupted it a dozen times over. Everyone knew me as the woman who never missed a deadline, never left a mess unresolved, and never played politics. My value was invisible, but it was there woven into the foundation. That was why the morning the HR director called me into her office felt so unreal. Her name was Jessica Lane, and she couldn't even meet my eyes as she slid the envelope across the polished desk. Departmental streamlining, she said, her voice rehearsed, her smile thin. Unfortunately, Valerie, your salary has been reduced. 60% effective next pay cycle. I sat there, my heart hammering so loud it drowned her words. 60%. It wasn't a trim, it was an execution. I wanted to laugh, to ask her if she was joking, but the seriousness in her tone told me everything. Jessica shifted uncomfortably, perhaps knowing the cruelty of the task she was performing. I thought of the years I had stayed late while she and others rushed home. I thought of the nights I carried folders full of contracts to my kitchen table, checking for errors that could cost millions. And here she was, telling me I was being streamlined, but I didn't explode. I didn't shout. I folded the letter, slipped it into my bag, and walked out of her office without another word. If they thought I would beg or crumble, they had chosen the wrong person to insult. On the elevator ride down, I caught my reflection in the steel doors. My face was calm, almost too calm. Inside, however, a storm was forming. At my desk, I stared out at the skyline. The city buzzed outside the window, oblivious to the injustice brewing in my veins. I knew one thing with crystal clarity. They had underestimated me. They believed I was nothing more than old glue holding things together until it crumbled on its own. What they didn't realize was that I was the architect of many of the company's deepest foundations, and I had built a trapdoor they had long forgotten. I started quietly. I pulled out old binders, dust-covered files I had tucked away in a cabinet no one else touched. My colleagues rushing past probably thought I was sulking in silence. Little did they know I was digging into the past with precision. Every contract I had reviewed, every amendment I had crafted, every clause I had pushed through years ago was about to be unearthed. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, I stayed behind in the archives room. The scent of paper and ink lingered in the air. My hands shook slightly as I pulled down the file from the Series B funding round. I remembered those days like yesterday. Back then, DataRaft was desperate for capital. Investors wanted protection, and I had written a safeguard that nobody but me truly understood. I flipped the pages, my eyes scanning the familiar text until I landed on it. Section 17D, reading it again sent chills up my spine. It was a clause so carefully worded that only a handful of people in the world would grasp its implications. It granted veto power against unsolicited acquisition bids over 30% equity, and the designated stakeholder listed as holding that veto power? Me, Valerie Hensley. My lips curled into a faint smile. They had just handed a loaded weapon to the woman they thought they had disarmed. Still, I didn't rush. Revenge isn't about speed, it's about accuracy. I spent nights cross-checking filings, making sure the clause hadn't been nullified or quietly erased. It was still there, untouched, buried under layers of jargon so dense no one had thought to question it. The arrogance of executives who believed no detail mattered unless it glittered in their reports had preserved my power all these years. The next step required stealth. I couldn't expose my hand too early. I needed a trigger, someone who would set events into motion without realizing I was behind it. That was when the name Elliot Carr crossed my mind, the shrewd, hungry leader of Ardent Solutions, our fiercest rival. He had always kept an eye on DataRaft, circling like a hawk waiting for weakness. If he believed an opportunity had opened, he would strike, but how to reach him without leaving fingerprints? I bought a cheap prepaid phone at a corner store, cash only. At my kitchen table, under the dim glow of a lamp, I created a new email account with a burner address. My fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, the weight of what I was about to do pressing on me. Then I began to type, Mr. Carr, I wrote, if you care to examine recent filings at Dataraft, you may notice certain irregularities that suggest upcoming turbulence. Opportunities like this don't last long. Signed, a friend. I read it 3 times before hitting send. Simple, vague, but enough to stir his instincts. I closed the laptop and leaned back, heart racing. That one message was a spark, and sparks, when dropped in dry fields, ignite infernos. The following week, I carried myself as though nothing had changed. I attended compliance meetings, answered emails, even forced a polite smile when Jessica walked past my desk. But inside, I was electric with anticipation. I checked news outlets discreetly, waiting for signs of movement. Then one morning, the headline appeared. Ardent Solutions launches $400 million unsolicited takeover bid for Dataraft. I nearly laughed aloud at my desk. Gasps echoed across the office floor as people huddled over their phones. Executives rushed into emergency meetings, the atmosphere charged with panic. And there I sat, silent, the architect of the storm they now scrambled to control. They thought I was weak. They thought I was expendable. But I had just triggered the largest crisis in the company's history, and not a single one of them knew the quiet woman at the corner desk had pulled the strings. The chaos inside Dataraft felt like a living thing. Phones rang endlessly, executives shouted across glass conference rooms, and the usually composed CEO, Daniel Mercer, looked like a man aging in fast forward. I watched it all from my corner desk, invisible but ever-present, the calm eye at the center of the storm. The takeover bid from Ardent Solutions hit everyone like a lightning strike. $400 million on the table was no small gesture, it was a declaration of war. I stayed quiet, but inside I was alive with a strange kind of fire. This wasn't just vengeance, it was balance being restored. The same people who had slashed my pay, who had dismissed me as outdated, were now facing the collapse of their empire. And I, the woman they had tried to erase, was the only one who knew the company wasn't entirely defenseless. The board scrambled to hire advisors. They pulled in lawyers, bankers, and consultants, all of them talking about poison pills and shareholder rights plans. The jargon floated through the air like smoke, but none of them seemed to grasp what was already written in black and white in their own corporate charter. I knew eventually they'd stumble onto Section 17D, but the longer they remained blind, the more leverage I would have when I revealed it. One evening, while executives worked themselves into exhaustion, I lingered in the records office again. I flipped through more old documents, tracing every thread of Section 17D, making sure there were no loopholes I had overlooked. It was airtight. I had written it during a time when investors demanded assurance against opportunistic buyouts. No one expected that protection would one day rest in the hands of someone like me. It was a peculiar feeling, walking through the office while knowing a secret that could change everything. Colleagues whispered nervously in break rooms, speculating about layoffs, mergers, or even bankruptcy. I kept my face neutral, sipping my coffee as if none of it mattered. Inside, however, I rehearsed the moment in my mind the instant I would finally speak, the words that would drop like hammers in the boardroom. But before I revealed myself, I needed to make sure Elliot Carr played his part well. I checked financial blogs and leaked reports. He was circling fiercely, his team poring over filings, dissecting weaknesses, and pushing hard with their bid. He smelled blood, and I had given him the scent. Ardent Solutions held press conferences, painting themselves as saviors ready to unlock Dataraft's potential. Watching Daniel Mercer grit his teeth during interviews almost made me laugh. He had spent years treating people like disposable cogs, and now he was the one being treated as replaceable. Days passed, and the tension thickened until finally, the board convened an emergency meeting. To my mild amusement, Jessica Lane from HR was there, sitting stiffly as though she didn't belong in the same room with these heavyweights. She cast a quick glance at me, surprise flickering in her eyes, because she couldn't understand why I had been invited. I simply sat down, calm, my old leather notebook resting in my lap. Daniel began the meeting with a grim voice. We're under siege. Ardent's bid is aggressive, hostile, and dangerous. If we don't find a defense, we may lose everything. His words filled the room with dread. Lawyers murmured about potential lawsuits, bankers talked about restructuring, but it all sounded like noise. I cleared my throat softly, and for the first time in years, every eye turned toward me. The quiet woman they barely noticed had interrupted. There is, I said, my tone even, one clause in our charter that changes everything. Daniel frowned. What clause? Section 17D, I replied, sliding a worn copy of the old funding agreement onto the table. Silence fell. Some board members leaned closer, scanning the dense paragraphs, their brows furrowing. It grants veto power against any unsolicited acquisition attempt that exceeds 30% equity, I explained. Then, slowly, deliberately, I added, and the veto power rests with a designated stakeholder listed on file. Who? Daniel demanded. I met his eyes, unflinching. Me. The room erupted. Some gasped, others exchanged incredulous glances. Jessica's face was drained of color. For a long moment, no one spoke, as if the weight of my words was too heavy to process. Finally, one of the board members, an older man named Leonard, cleared his throat. Is this valid? Binding? It is, I said firmly. I wrote it myself. It has never been amended, never revoked. Legally, no acquisition of this nature can proceed without my consent. Daniel leaned back, his face pale with fury. You're telling us the entire company's fate rests in your hands? I allowed myself the faintest smile. Exactly. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Where moments ago I had been invisible, now I was indispensable. The power dynamic flipped on its head, and I savored the shock etched into every executive's face. They had cut my pay, belittled my role, and now they realized I was the only barrier standing between them and annihilation. The arguments began immediately. Some insisted I must reject the bid outright to protect the company. Others argued I should accept, take the money, and let Arden absorb us. The voices grew louder, desperate. I simply sat still, my hand resting on the notebook, letting them sweat. Finally, when the shouting reached a fever pitch, I raised my voice. There is a third option. They quieted, waiting. We can use this as leverage, I continued. Renegotiate governance, restructure compliance, shift the board composition so it reflects accountability. I will serve as interim governance liaison with full oversight of compliance and internal controls. That way, Arden withdraws, but we don't return to the same complacency that led us here. Daniel's jaw tightened. You're suggesting we give you unprecedented authority? I'm not suggesting, I said softly. I'm stating the only terms under which I'll exercise my veto in Dataraft's favor. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Everyone knew I had them trapped. They could either watch their empire collapse under Arden's takeover or hand me the power I had just demanded. The irony was poetic. The same executives who had dismissed me as irrelevant now had no choice but to bend. One by one, the board members looked at each other, their expressions resigned. Finally, Leonard spoke. I move that we accept Valerie's terms. Reluctant nods followed. Daniel looked at me like a man who had swallowed poison, but he had no choice. He leaned forward, his voice low. You've played us all, haven't you? I met his glare with calm certainty. No, Daniel, you played yourself. I simply wrote the rules. In the days that followed, the shift was immediate. Arden withdrew their bid, frustrated at the invisible wall they couldn't breach. Dataraft announced new governance measures to reassure shareholders, though the press never learned the real story. And me? I was given an office on the 17th floor, higher than the one I had occupied for decades. From that window, I looked out at the city with a quiet satisfaction. I had defended the company they tried to strip me from, and in doing so, I carved my place in stone. No one would ever again call me obsolete. The 17th floor was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Gone was the chatter of interns, the shuffle of papers, the clicking of hurried keyboards. Here, the carpet muffled footsteps, the walls were lined with abstract art no one truly understood, and the offices bore names that once seemed untouchable. Yet one of those glass-walled rooms now belonged to me. The brass plaque read, Governance, Liaison Valerie Hensley. Seeing it for the first time made my chest tighten with something I hadn't felt in years, vindication. But vindication is never the end of the story. It's only the beginning of a reckoning. The very next week I attended my first official board meeting in my new role. Daniel Mercer sat at the far end of the table, his once commanding presence now shrunken, like a balloon losing air. He tried to act as though nothing had changed, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He despised the fact that I, the woman he had all but discarded, now wielded the authority he had lost. The meeting began stiffly. Financial advisors presented charts predicting turbulence in shareholder confidence. Public relations experts detailed strategies to spin our sudden governance reforms as forward-thinking rather than desperate. Yet beneath all their words, the same truth simmered. Without my signature, without my veto power, nothing they proposed mattered. And they all knew it. At one point, Daniel interrupted an advisor mid-sentence. This is unnecessary. We don't need to reinvent compliance or hand over sweeping powers. We need stability, not upheaval. His eyes flicked toward me, sharp as blades. We don't need Valerie rewriting the rules. I leaned forward, folding my hands. My voice was calm, deliberate. Daniel, stability is exactly what led us here. Stability bred arrogance, complacency, and blind spots. The world doesn't respect stability. It respects strength. The room fell quiet. I could feel the board leaning toward me, not him. That subtle shift was the real victory, not the office, not the title, but the recognition that I was now the axis around which everything turned. Days turned into weeks, and the reforms I proposed began taking shape. Compliance was no longer a dusty department ignored by executives. It became the cornerstone of every major decision. I demanded quarterly audits that exposed wasteful spending. I established reporting systems that stripped away Daniel's opaque power. I appointed younger, overlooked managers to roles where they could shine. Bypassing the sycophants who had coasted for years, the company started to change. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. And through it all, Daniel fought me tooth and nail. He questioned my directives in front of the board, whispered to allies in hallways, and tried to rally resistance. But each time, I responded not with anger, but with facts, contracts, filings, clauses. I buried him under the very weight of the law he had once dismissed me for caring too much about. One evening, long after most had gone home, I stood by the glass wall of my office, staring at the city lights below. Jessica Lane knocked softly and stepped in. She looked smaller than I remembered, her arrogance replaced by something fragile. Valerie, she began, her voice hesitant. I didn't know about the clause. I didn't know you held that kind of power. I turned, my face unreadable. You didn't need to know, Jessica. You only needed to respect the people who kept this place standing. But you chose convenience over respect. Her eyes glistened. I was following orders, so was I. I said simply, except the orders I followed were the ones I wrote myself. She lowered her gaze and left without another word. I didn't really hate her. She was just a messenger, a pawn used to deliver a blow others didn't have the courage to face me with. But her moment of regret confirmed something. Everyone who had doubted me was now reckoning with their miscalculation. The climax came 3 months later. A shareholder assembly had been called to discuss the company's trajectory after the failed takeover. It was broadcast live, a rare transparency measure meant to calm the public. Daniel sat on stage beside me, his tie too tight, his palms sweating. I, on the other hand, felt strangely serene. When the floor opened for questions, one investor stood up and asked, "Why should we trust DataRaft to protect our interests when it was nearly swallowed whole by Ardent Solutions? What has truly changed?" The room went still. Daniel fumbled for words, rambling about strategy and resilience. I let him speak, let him tangle himself in vague promises, before I leaned toward the microphone. My voice was steady, each word chosen like a scalpel. "What has changed is accountability," I said. For decades, this company treated compliance as an afterthought, governance as a nuisance. That era is over. I carry the authority to prevent any hostile acquisition, and I've made it clear that power comes with a price: transparency, responsibility, and reform. I am not here to protect executives. I am here to protect this company and every stakeholder who believes in it. Applause erupted, genuine and sustained. For the first time, the crowd wasn't clapping for Daniel or for the abstract idea of leadership. They were clapping for me, for the invisible spine that had always been there but had finally stepped into the light. Later that evening, Daniel resigned. The announcement was terse, delivered through a press release that cited personal reasons. But everyone knew the truth. He had lost the war. He had been dethroned not by a rival company, not by shareholders, but by the woman he had once deemed irrelevant. When I walked into my office the next morning, a bouquet of white lilies sat on my desk with a simple card that read, "To the quiet storm who saved us." No name was signed, but it didn't matter. I knew I had left a mark no one could erase. Sitting by the window, watching the sun rise over the city skyline, I finally allowed myself a long breath. My revenge hadn't been loud or violent. It had been calculated, patient, devastating in its precision. They cut my pay, tried to shrink me, but in doing so, they awakened a part of me even though I had forgotten the part that knew my worth was never in the numbers on a paycheck but in the foundations I had built with my own hands. And now, from the 17th floor, I could see farther than ever before. Moral lesson. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't about tearing others down, it's about proving that you were unshakable all along. My story is a reminder that silence does not equal weakness. The world will always undervalue the quiet ones, the detail keepers, the invisible architects. But one well-placed clause, one forgotten safeguard, one moment of clarity can turn the tables entirely. When people underestimate you, let them. When they cut your pay, dismiss your voice, or treat you as background noise, remember, your power isn't lost, it's waiting for the right moment to emerge. The sharpest victories are not those shouted in anger but those revealed in calm, deliberate precision. I want you to hold on to this. Respect yourself even when others don't, because one day, your quiet strength will command the room they thought you'd never enter. If you loved this story, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. And please, drop your thoughts in the comments. What lesson do you see in my journey? I'd love to hear your perspective, because at the end of the day, every scar, every setback, every slight can be transformed into a story of power.